Thanks to our Patreon members for helping to make this episode possible, and we're now available on all the major podcasting platforms. You can find more information at the links below. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a Symposium on the Symposium. For our summer project, we're going to read through the Symposium from beginning to end and do a really deep dive, what I hope to be a really deep dive into understanding this crucial, if you held me down and said, what's the one work you have to understand Western philosophy, also why Western philosophy is different from Hindu or Chinese philosophical traditions, it would be Plato's Symposium. This is the work. Plato is the man, and the Symposium of his works is the work. And to understand this and understand what is under so many of our assumptions and so many of the outlooks that we have in the way the world works, how we understand ourselves, we're just swimming in a sea of Plato, and we don't know it because, of course, we're fish. So, to begin with, I wanted to do a first lecture that was a background on the text itself, its political and social and historical, perspective on where it was, why it was important, and how it was transmitted through time so that we could understand when we get into the work, which itself doesn't seem particularly political on the surface, is in fact wildly, wildly political, and that those implications still inform how we think about government and just about everything, basically, but even things like government, which again does not seem itself self-evident when you're just looking at the text in isolation rather than in the context in which Plato was constructing the text and how it's been received through the years. So, to begin with, this is, of course, a Greek text. It was written in the Greek world. Now, we call it the Greek world, but the Greeks, who we refer to as the Greeks today, were actually referred to themselves as the Hellenes. And what's important about this is it's one of these weird, what would seem weird to us, cultural, social, political institutions or organizations that we don't really understand because we're children of the nation state. And we look back in history and go, well, Egypt was a nation state. It really wasn't. All these countries we think of were basically like us. And then we look at the Greek world and it's like, well, what were they? And what they were was a kind of loose confederation organized around they called themselves the Hellenes. So they were aware of this. They weren't, it wasn't like us retroactively creating this structure. But it was nothing. These were not nation states in any way. The Hellenistic world was organized first around language. So to be a member of the Hellenistic community, you had to be Greek as your primary language. Now, many of these people spoke different languages because they were often small communities in the midst of larger cultural forces. But it was the Greek speaking was crucial. They shared the religious outlook. So they had the sort of classic panoply of Greek gods, but it's much bigger than that. It's sort of their pantheistic worldview, which gave them a sense of history and placed them within a global context and within this mythological narrative, occupied their minds. And so this included things like the importance of the Oracle of Delphi, very central to their cultural understanding. They had the Iliad and the Odyssey. These were generally transmitted as oral texts, but now, then they became written texts. But the degree to which those are referenced and are continually brought up in Greek texts is phenomenal. You can think of those as sort of the founding texts, maybe, of the Hellenistic world. That's maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but it's not a lot of an exaggeration. So these are crucial. And the Olympic Games also very important in organizing the society. So what you had was this whole series of city-states and even larger than city-states, because you get these sort of smaller political entities, sometimes city-states, something like Sparta was not just a city-state, it was bigger than that, organized around this region that stretched at times from the outside of the Black Sea into Egypt, up almost all the way to Egypt, right? So just a vast spread centered on the Greek islands, of course. But, that but they were in the midst of other culture. There were also outposts, there were settlements, they were cities on the coast that were primarily trading cities. So there was any number of ways this was expressed, but they looked inward and saw themselves as somehow all closely related. So this is step one. It was a loose coalition of cultural sort of shared feeling built around a common language, common religious outlook, and some social practices and books or stories and narratives like the Iliad and the Odyssey, and sort of ways and outlooks on life. But it was not a political unity or polity in any way, constantly at war with themselves and each other, which is become important in a second. And so there was this massive diversity and sort of chaos almost when we look back on it, that was organized under this umbrella of the Hellenistic world, the sense that, we're still Hellenes, even though we fight all the time and kill each other all the time and are negotiating with supposedly our enemies all the time and doing all this. Nonetheless, despite all of this, we're still a sort of a family, as it were. So within the Hellenistic world, there had just been the Peloponnesian War. Now we're getting to Plato's life himself. So the Peloponnesian War runs, 430 BCE to 404 BCE, so long. So, we're talking about a, 26, 27-year war. And that's particularly in the ancient world, that's a long, a 25-year war is a long war in any case. But when you consider the lifespan at the time, is considerably shorter. We're not helping, of course. We're talking people who would live most of their lives knowing only the Peloponnesian War. Plato was born around 427, so the war has just kicked off, and he'll be, 22, 23 when the war wraps up. So for his maturity from the time he was born till the time he becomes 20, 21, 22, around in there, it is the thing that's happening, right? This is the story that's going on is the Peloponnesian War, and this was a war primarily between Athens and Sparta. And Athens, the famous home of democracy, these sorts of things, had become a pretty powerful empire. And Sparta was, but they were primarily a naval trading empire with lots of allies from whom they were basically taking tribute. So they weren't necessarily directly conquering these people, but they were in alliances that allowed them to gather tax revenue. So their navy is growing stronger, and Sparta feels threatened by this. And so, again, you don't have time to go into the entirety of the Peloponnesian War. The importance for Plato and for understanding Plato's works is these two very different polities within the Hellenistic world, Sparta and Athens. They almost couldn't be more different. A sort of vague democracy, the birthplace of democracy, that was primarily a sea power and a trading power, goes to war with Sparta, which is not a democracy, is a incredibly repressive, military nightmare, and that's land-based, primarily a land power, not a sea power, and primarily agrarian, not trade and naval. Doesn't have that trading naval outlook. They go to war for 25 years, and they just wreck each other, and they wreck much of the Hellenistic world in the process. So this is just Hellenistic wide, their entire, this entire polity, this greater sort of cultural sphere is just wrecked. And the wealth is destroyed, property is destroyed, people are destroyed, cities are destroyed, just the whole thing gets ground down for 25 years. And the people participating knew this. They're, if you read Thucydides or other people of the time, they're like, oh my gosh, this is a bad idea. Aristophanes, they're like, oh, can we not do this? Please, this is not helping, right? This doesn't help in any way. Our enemies on the outside are cheer for us as we tear ourselves apart from the inside. At the end of which, Sparta wins. and Sparta defeats Athens and overthrows democracy, and they set up what the sort of tyranny of the 30. So 30 oligarchs are set up, and so it's a sort of an oligarchic rule that then gets overthrown, and then a sort of a democracy gets reestablished, but it's a very nervous democracy. And this is part of the process of Socrates being put to death, is because the very nervous democracy is afraid Socrates is a threat for bringing back the oligarchy. So this is Plato's life. Now, he was born into an aristocratic family, which still had a lot of influence in democratic Athens. And then he saw, like, his uncle was a member of the ruling 30 oligarchs. But this doesn't necessarily mean he was hugely sympathetic to them. It just meant this was the politics of the time. So his aristocratic tradition is both opposed to the democratic rule of Athens as it was constituted when he was born and as he was raised. And then he sees that defeated. In any case, he sees his city defeated. And, to be an aristocrat in a destroyed city-state is, it's not that great. I mean, it's better than being a slave in a destroyed city-state, but still, your power base, your historical view of yourself, all of this is overthrown because here comes Sparta. And Sparta is not like a fan of Athenian aristocracy. So, it's easy to go, oh, well, the Spartans came in and put in the Athenian aristocracy because they're aristocrats. The Spartans were not aristocrats. The Spartans they had their own bizarro world that they were living in. And it just was nothing to do with the Athenian traditions at all. And so the fine negotiation between the preceding aristocracy and the rising democracy lost the war. And everybody felt this. And so then Sparta comes in, they put the tyranny of the 30 in, which is wildly unpopular basically with everybody. They overthrow the tyranny. And so now we're back. And this is the context in which Socrates was eventually killed by this, but then this is where Plato grew up, and this is the environment that he's writing in. And part of this political unrest and social unrest that he lived through led him around 390. Okay, but remember these ancient dates, although the dates for Plato are historically speaking pretty good. Still, you always want to be, exact dates, it's tricky. But around 399, after the death of Socrates, he was put to death, sentenced to death by the Athenian democracy, Plato seems to have said, let's leave. let's go on vacation. Let's take a break from Athens because this political situation seems fraught. He wasn't happy with what was going on around him. Obviously, very disillusioning to see your mentor and the person you idolized put to death by your society. And so he heads out and he goes to Egypt. He goes to Italy, Cyrene. He goes to a whole bunch of places. And then he finally returns to Athens and founds his academy. And the most important part, all of this for him is very important, but he was gone for a while. I think it was about 399. He founds the academy in 387. So, he's gone for a good solid 3-ish years, traveling around and studying abroad functionally is what he was doing. Both like, hey, let's not be there, and then let's come back and set up a new system. Very important in these travels was his encounter with Pythagoreans and the history of Pythagorean philosophy, which I'll cover a little bit later when we get to that part of the Symposium, will have a huge influence on his outlook and thinking. How much of the Pythagorean ideals he already had imbibed in Athens prior to going to meet the actual Pythagoreans is hard. It's hard to track down, but certainly the impact that they had on him after that was pronounced. So we have this philosopher who grows up in a society facing just huge threats, political unrest, is defeated and overthrown by an external power, the Spartans, but yet still part of the Hellenistic world, which made him question both his aristocratic background and any notion of democracy. He saw his mentor put to death by his society, and it caused him to, as you can well imagine, have a lot of questions. And what he came up with was, wow, things aren't being run very well, which is not a crazy thing to say when this is what you've seen. And he just really struggled with mostly every aspect of his society. And so he comes back, he sets up the academy, he starts studying, and he's very actively political in his thinking. I mean, he writes the Republic, he writes the laws, right? So this is not some great insight on my part, but this informs everything he's talking about. So that when we get to the symposium, what happens is, although it looks theoretically like a dialogue and discourse about love, which it is, amongst many other things, it is always important to note this is within the context of trying to figure out, in this crazy world where everybody else seems to be messing things up, how is it that we sit down and come to know what is right, what's the correct approach, and then how do we put that into action? Notice in Plato you get this consistently, this emphasis on and then put into action. And so when we read through the Symposium, when you're reading the Symposium, always keep this in mind. The stakes for Plato are immense. He is, he's seen his society destroyed, conquered by Sparta. He's seen his uncle become a tyrant and then be overthrown as a tyrant, right? And it's not clear he thought his uncle was doing a great job on either side, right? Like, so it's not like he's going, oh, my uncle's a tyrant, great, yay, now we're winning. It seems that he was pretty skeptical of that as well. He's traveled around. He's seen other ways of thinking about the world. He's seen other city-states that have totally different systems. He's seen the Spartan system that seemed to win. They won the war. This suggests that you're doing something right. And all of this has fed into his desire to say, okay, when I talk about how should people relate to other people, how should we know what's the right thing to love, how should we know the right thing to do, he's asking it within the context where the stakes are, my mentor has been put to death, my society has been destroyed, we were trying to rebuild it. What is the best way to do this so that you can build something that lasts and you can build it on the foundation of true knowledge, of insight into absolutes, so that you can make sure you're not just doing something that's going to get blown away on the next wave that rolls in from history. So for Plato, and I think this is one thing that gives his work such immediacy, for Plato, what you're reading is this, he's focused. He's not messing around, right? It's, we talk, idle speculation. We always have these images of these philosophers wandering around, their long robes, they have the beards, we have the great paintings from the Renaissance, and we have these ethereal, thinkers. No, Socrates fought in the war, the Peloponnesian War, on several different campaigns. Plato is there when his city falls. These are not abstract. He flees, maybe a bit of a strong word. He decides it's best to take a vacation. All of these elements inform him so that when he's trying to solve these problems, he's really trying. He's not sort of pretending to reflect and go, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we could come up with some ideas? No, he's trying to solve the problems of how do you set up a society that's stable and ethical and helps the people be the best kinds of people they can be and leads them. Now, his conclusions, we can debate and argue about everything all the time, of course. However, this is the ambition that he has, and this is the motivation that he has. So he is striving with every capacity that he has, and boy, does he have some capacity to try and answer these very fundamental questions, because he felt them palpably in his life every day. His life was likely under threat at times. He saw Socrates put to death. He saw his society destroyed. So that's sort of the framing of all of Plato's works, but particularly when we look at the Symposium, it's important to remember that, because it does seem like this less politically loaded than obviously in something like the Republic or the Laws, but it's not. It's still there. It's still resonant. This is still the core of what's happening. And now, again, to skip to the other side of this, Why is this such an important work? Why can I say, like, this is probably the single most important work by the single most important philosopher? And that one is pretty easy to answer, I would say. And what happens is it's important to remember that the New Testament was written in Greek, bad Greek, not Platonic Greek. Platonic Greek, spectacularly good Greek, sort of literary Greek of the highest order. In fact, I wish I knew Greek. I do not speak ancient Greek, unfortunately. I do not read it. The alphabet, I tried twice, and both times the alphabet, just like with Sanskrit, when I tried to learn Sanskrit, turns out I need a Latin alphabet. The squiggly alphabets, I can't get there. My mind, my eyes, I just doesn't work that way. One of my frustrations. But putting that aside, all the evidence is that and this is don't take my word for it, but that the beauty and power of his writing in part comes from the fact that he was a beautiful writer, right? Like the Greek is captivating in itself. It's the literary quality of it is seductive. So the New Testament is written in Greek. And so what this meant was for generations of Christian scholars, to have Greek was vital. And if you're going to have Greek, then of course the Greek classics become crucial to your education. And this is this kind of weird feedback loop takes place where the inheritance of the Greek world becomes written into the way we read Christianity. And so to the degree that Christianity has influenced the Western world, which is, let's just say, a pretty significant degree, I think we can all agree on that, for good or ill, take it as you will, but certainly influential, right? Let's all just write that down. Yes, Christianity had an influence on our worldview. What's less clear, though, is that it's actually not so much Christianity in its content. It's really Platonic, or at least Neoplatonic, and Neoplatonism. I mean, it is so much of what we think is in the Bible is not in the Bible. It's actually in Plato. And so what happens is all of these Platonic ideas get written into how we read the Bible. A little bit of it is in the New Testament because, of course, they're writing primarily in Greek, and so those Greek concepts are just around. But these were not particularly well-educated Greeks. The Greek is, again, not that impressive, and so it's just not there. And I'll give you some examples of this here in a second. But what happens is all of the Greek scholars who have to interpret, translate, explain, Augustine, Boethius, Aslam, Thomas Aquinas, right? These guys are Platonists. They're heavily, heavily influenced by Plato. And so when they read the New Testament, and if they have access to the Greek, they're reading it as if it was written by Plato. And so all these things that are difficult to understand in the New and Old Testament, of course, the Old Testament basically has none of this in it. The New Testament has a hint of it, but it gets written in. So just as an example, the body-soul division, there's a few passages here and there in the New Testament that you can kind of read as maybe making a big deal of this. Oh, this is pure Plato. So to the extent that you've ever heard that, our bodies die and our souls go up to heaven, this is not a New Testament concept. This is a Platonic concept that was written into the New Testament by the people who interpreted the Bible. It's just that it's been around for so long and it's so powerful that we just think it came to us from the New Testament. That was sort of the method of transmission. But it's Plato, Plato, Plato. Indeed, it's probably the Pythagoreans, again, which we'll return to. The Trinity. Oh my gosh. People have been trying to pull their hair out for however many. There's been lots of people were burnt at the stake about trying to figure out what the hell the Trinity means. All these heretics and controversy, and the Trinity is hard to understand because it's not in the New Testament, right? And this is what many of the heretics kept saying. This is not in the Bible. Like, you read the Bible, there's not there. It doesn't exist. Can't find it. Not a thing. And yet it becomes the way that you read it. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. What are you talking about? This is pure as we'll see in the Symposium. When we get these passages, of course, I'll highlight this and you'll go, oh, right, there it is. This is the Trinity. This is pure Platonism. I mean, really pure Platonism. The undiluted Platonic thinking helps you get to the notion of the Trinity. So, just as an example here is in the New Testament, when after the apocalypse or however you read all this stuff comes back, we're supposed to be back in our bodies. It's a bodily resurrection. Remember, Jesus came back in his body. It was a bodily resurrection. Plato has no use for that at all. Like, Plato has no interest in bodies. Like, bodies are just this sort of hopeless, misleading, sack of salt water about which he is completely uninterested in. So the biblical passages about what salvation and resurrection look like are often just run counter to what Plato's vision is. It just turns out that we've gone with Plato's vision. Forget the New Testament, forget the Bible. We're going to go with Plato because the people who structured the way that we read the New Testament were Platonists through and through, or Neoplatonists, depending on how you want to run those definitions. And so what we have inherited through the means of Christianity is an understanding of Christianity that is so absolutely Platonist that it is hard to imagine. And indeed, many of the arguments about heresy throughout the history of the Christian church, and the Catholic Church in particular, were based on the fact that a lot of these people would read the Bible finally when they could get access to it, or scholars, and they'd be like, this looks like a lot of Greek. This looks like a lot of Greek non-Christian pagan ideas are being smuggled in on top of us. And then the church fathers would say, well, yeah, but that's what we're going with. So, off with your head, or we're going to torture you, or we're going to burn you, or however, whatever the moment, the way you're dealing with heretics at the moment happened to be. And so it's fascinating to read church history from this point of view. And once you see this, or once you recognize this, and if you bother to read, for whatever bizarre reason, the history of the Catholic Church up until the Reformation in particular. And Calvinism, by the way, is like almost a purified Neoplatonism, again, as we'll see as we read the Symposium. What you end up with is a debate between heretics, or who defined as heretics retroactively, who are trying to salvage some of the more, actual content basis of the Bible, versus often the Greek philosophers who happen to live in, 13th century Italy, going, we're going to go Plato and Aristotle. Thanks for the offer, but we're really just going to go with Plato. And final note, mentioned the magic name there that I haven't mentioned yet, which I should have, which is Aristotle. And it's important to note that Aristotle's contribution to this, which is huge, like, again, you don't want to say Aristotle, kick him over, but the core sort of philosophical outlooks about things like the nature of the soul, the nature of the body, what does it mean to be defined, how is God, these come from Plato. These are Platonic ideas. Aristotle's contribution was the Aristotelian logic, the Aristotelian understanding of nature. So and these were, of course, mixed and blended, and you can't unweave this cloth per se. But the core ideas of what we're going to talk about and what we'll see in the Symposium are absolutely Platonic, even though for some reason if you read like a brief history or a brief review, they talk a lot more about Aristotle as because of his Aristotelian logic and these kinds of concepts. And Aristotle left a lot more texts, yet a lot of them survived compared with Plato. But it's the Platonic core philosophical ideas that influence the way we understand particularly the New Testament and hence modern Christianity, which ends up being simply, as we'll see, a version of Neoplatonism. It's more Neoplatonist in many ways than it is actually coherent with the Bible narrative that is given in the New Testament, to the degree that's coherent, which is not actually that much. So, final note on this. How do we get these texts? So the most recent existing text that has Plato's work in it is from about 800 AD, I believe. I wrote this down. Maybe I didn't write this down. Okay, so let's just say 800-ish AD. And so there's that means we're looking at about 1,000 years of transmission through scribal tradition. And this is not surprising because this is pretty systematically how most of these texts came down to us. Shockingly, because there's so many excerpts and there's so many Latin authors who translated Plato and so many commentaries that contain sections of them, that the main works of Plato seem to be very accurately transmitted. And this is important because we can be pretty sure when we're reading Plato that we've got a good text. There's lots of cross-references. There's lots of outside information. And so we could spend some time because, doing the deep dive and I thought about this of going, is this the real Symposium? Is there? And it turns out that, we could do that, but I don't think it's that productive. It's sufficiently well documented and it's sufficiently well cross-referenced in the scholarship that I think we can kind of take it as given with a small asterisk. But this really does seem to be what Plato wrote, 1,000 years before we had an actual text still maintaining it, right? Like an actual near full text of his works that came into existence or came into preservation. So, and that's pretty rare. And so another reason that Plato had such an impact is because, it's sort of a feedback loop, because everybody was copying him because he was so important. He was really important because he was the guy that everybody was copying, if that makes sense, right? So once you start being copied, everybody keeps copying you. Therefore, all the scholars have copied you. Therefore, all the scholars know you. It's important to remember this, that these scholars were actually copying the books that they had themselves. And so think about if every book that you had was a book you had handwritten yourself, how your knowledge and understanding and engagement with those works would be different from, I went to the store, I bought it, I went to the library and I checked it out, and then I read it. Actually copying it by hand, wow, this is a very different engagement with a text, and it makes it much stronger. But it also means that you can have access to fewer texts, and that the ones you do access have a much deeper impact on you. And so for 1,000 years, you have scholars handwriting. And so this just refines and amplifies the impact that something like Plato's works or Aristotle's works or the other surviving works that we have had, because you get this narrow access to text, but the texts that you do have access to become hugely important, in part because of their rarity. So I'm going to take the text as given and not spend a huge amount of time on, that sort of study of that. So we'll just that's one thing we're not going to do a deep dive onto because it's sufficiently well documented. I think we can take it, again, as given-ish. So, brief introduction to this, but just a note, when reading, please remember these two big messages I guess I'm trying to give here to summarize. On one hand, you have that Plato was writing from a very sense of urgency and focus. These were not abstract questions to him. He lived in a time of chaos and change and defeat and reconstruction and threats to his life and seeing his mentor killed by his society. And he was trying to answer these questions. And the other side of this is that the inheritance of the answers that he came up with have so powerfully shaped our societies that it's just a Western society, by the way. It's just hard to imagine. And for me, one of the breakthroughs was when I started really studying Hindu philosophical tradition and Chinese philosophical tradition. What you realize is they just didn't have this, right? And so because they did not have this, you feel like, oh my gosh, this profoundly different. What's the difference? The difference is in a word, it's Plato, right? Like they didn't have a Plato. They had other people who had these kinds of influences on them. But so much of what we take for granted, so much of our outlook, some of our knee-jerk or just deep-seated opinion about how things must be have grown from these Platonic roots, and we don't even recognize it. And so when we read, this is what we're going to encounter, and that's why it's important to, I think, to do a very deep and close reading of a work like the Symposium, because it just has all these elements. It was both urgent for Plato in this time, and it's transmitted to us powerfully and written into our society. So it's urgent in our minds today, even though we don't know the origins are probably Platonic for many, many of these concepts. And finally, also, it's funny. I think it's important. Having said how serious and how urgent it is, it's also funny and entertaining, and it's a play. If you can read this as a play, as much as it is a dialogue or as a strict philosophical text, I think it'll be more fun. And I think it's important to have fun with this because it is funny. It does have these moments. I mean, Aristophanes appears, so he's always going to be great. Just Alcibiades. I mean, you just got to love these characters. What a great cast of characters that are going to walk through this. And so if you can keep that also in mind, that we tend to think of it has to be serious and deadly and all this, but no, it doesn't. And when I've mentioned this before, Symposium is one of the great works that you can tell if people have actually read philosophy or not, because if you've read the critiques and you've read the summaries and you've read the précis and you've taken the tests, you don't recognize how absolutely crazy many of the core works of the Western philosophical tradition are. And Symposium is key amongst them. It's a crazy work. I mean, it's nothing like you would expect if you've only ever had, introduction to philosophy and, here's the 6 takeaways. And no, it's a much crazier text than that. It's much more fun. It's much more entertaining, I think much wiser text than is often given to us because we're in a society that loves the quick précis and the Wikipedia entry and we only have, we're going to cover Greek philosophy in 3 weeks. And so we've got to mention the Symposium. So there'll be 2 tests on the question about the Symposium. So be ready to, answer those. And then we'll be moving right along. But when you stop and read it, I hope you'll have the same experience that I did the first time I read this, which is I'm like, well, this is madness. I didn't expect this at all. I think it's one of the reasons I enjoy philosophy so much is because of the impacts that Plato's writing, actually the writing itself, had on me, although I don't have access to the Greek, unfortunately. But even in translation, where you just go, well, these people are great. Like, who doesn't want to be? I want to go to the Symposium. I want to be there in this crazy cast of characters, drinking wine and arguing about the nature of love, because by God, this just seems to have been a pretty damn fine party in many ways. So, quick introduction and framing lecture on Plato's Symposium. So if you're interested, please grab a copy. And we're going to start rolling, and we'll have the first lecture coming up shortly, hopefully by Friday. But we'll see. I just have to, it's lots of research, and I've been going back and forth to different parts of the Symposium, and basically I'm losing my mind. And so I've got to narrow it down and see what is actually coverable. So anyway, thank you very much, and I do hope you enjoy reading the Symposium as much as I have enjoyed working on it.